Hey YouTube, Ethan here. Today we're going to be looking at the metal refinery, how to set it up as a beginner, and how to transition into a more advanced setup like you see here, so it becomes a sustainable way to produce your refined metals. This is a follow-up to my steel production video, which goes over some of the beginner elements of how to produce steel, such as how to source all the ingredients needed. But I deliberately skipped over the metal refinery because it is a more complicated setup than I wanted to make for that video. So in this video, we're going to cover the metal refinery fully. This is going to be a video aimed towards beginner players. So as with all of my beginner player tutorials, there's going to be a lot of improvements that players will be able to make throughout their playthrough once they have a better understanding of the game mechanics. I do this intentionally for all my videos that are aimed towards beginners because most of the time you can get away with inefficient setups on the Terra asteroid. My tutorials usually don't have a lot of mathematics implied. However, I'm going to change that a little bit in this tutorial because it is a critical feature of the metal refinery to understand how certain materials, metals, and liquids interact with this building. So as always, if you're a more experienced player, all of this information that you may get from this video may already be something that you know. So feel free to leave in the comments if I have missed anything critical that I should have put in the video for new players. And if you're a new player, by the end of this tutorial, you should understand fully how to use the metal refinery. And if you watch my steel production video, you should be able to use both videos together to start your mid-game phase of oxygen not included and begin producing refined metals and steel. So with that, let's get into the metal refinery and oxygen not included. To start things off, let's take a look at how we build the metal refinery and what inputs it needs for it to function. Our metal refinery is not made from traditional metals that you would normally find for buildings like this. It is made from different elements that are found throughout the map, such as sandstone, igneous rock, granite, or even ceramic that you produce. These different materials will have different overheat temperatures for the building. However, heat for the metal refinery is treated a lot different than buildings that are performing similar tasks, such as the rock crusher. The rock crusher, for instance, outputs heat in its immediate surroundings. The metal refinery outputs heat in liquid that is connected to it via piping. Let's take a look at how this works. The metal refinery has an input and an output for liquid that you're going to be plumbing into it. We're going to call this coolant, as that's exactly what the nature of this liquid is. Depending on the operation that you're using for the metal refinery, the coolant that you use for the metal refinery and the operation that you are selecting for use of the metal refinery will drastically change the output temperature of the coolant relative to its input temperature. You'll see what I mean in just a second. The metal refinery also takes 120 watts of power. Although this seems like a lot, this can actually run at a power positive depending on what type of operation mode you are running this in. And I will get to this later in the video as well. Generally, the best coolant to use is whatever you have readily available, as nearly all liquids will work. However, there are different considerations you can make for different types of coolants. Depending on what type of coolant you use for this metal refinery, and depending on what operation mode you have it running in, meaning what type of metal you are trying to produce, you can run this at a power positive. This means building a steam turbine above it and having the liquid heat water into steam, which will power the steam turbine and allow the metal refinery to run at a positive ratio. I'm not going to focus on too much of that in this video, as I prefer to have the metal refinery connected directly into the main base power grid, and having the steam turbines feed the power back also into the main base power grid. You definitely want to consider the evaporation temperature of whatever liquid you're trying to use. If you don't, it can lead to your output pipe breaking if the liquid that you're using turns into steam, or it changes into a different liquid. Let's take a look at exactly what I mean. We're on the metal refinery on the oxygennotIncluded.fandom.com. This is an excellent resource for new players and advanced players at getting information on buildings that you're trying to build and the entire game in general. This chart is very important for considerations that you'll want to make for the metal refinery. And what I just talked about will start to make sense as we go over this chart. Depending on the output of the material that you're trying to produce and the liquid that you're using as your coolant, there will be different amounts of heat transfer from the metal refinery operation into the coolant. So for example, if our coolant is water and we're producing gold, we will have a 6 degrees increase in our temperature of the coolant that is expelled from the metal refinery. Crude oil will be 15 degrees, and same thing with petroleum. Supercoolant, which is a very late game material, is something that we're not going to cover, but obviously it can be the best for certain designs. and for certain objectives that you're trying to meet. Taking a look at iron and steel, you can see that these have very dramatic increases in the temperatures of all of our coolants. If we focus on just the bottom 3 rows, we can see that steel will produce a plus 138 increase in our crude oil temperature and a plus 132 increase in our petroleum temperature. For water, it will increase it by 55 degrees. If you combine this with the evaporation temperature of crude oil, petroleum, and our water, now it starts to make sense which of these you can use for running with a steam turbine and which of these you want to avoid using unless you don't care about capturing any of that additional heat. This is because the steam turbine requires the steam to be at a minimum 125 degrees temperature for it to operate. Therefore, if we're using water, we know that water evaporates at 100 degrees Celsius. So it will never reach the temperature of 125 degrees inside the liquid pipe, and therefore it is an extremely difficult liquid to use more than once unless you're actively cooling it. However, if you're using crude oil or petroleum, the temperature of the output liquid will be plus 138 and plus 132 degrees respectively. Therefore, these two liquids are incredibly useful if you're running the metal refinery with a steam turbine. The steam turbine will delete the heat and turn it into energy, which will effectively help supply more power into the main power grid for the operations of the metal refinery. So having said all that about the type of liquids that you can use as your coolant, why did I say earlier that the best coolant is the one that you generally have readily available? That is because it is very easy to use large amounts of coolants, such as massive pools of polluted water, to dissipate the heat that comes out of the metal refinery. Let's run an example. In this setup, we have a metal refinery fed by 27 degrees Celsius polluted water, and we are expelling that same water that we're using as our coolant into the same pool of liquid that is just slightly farther away from the pump. This is a fairly typical setup on an asteroid that you might dig out, where you'll have a massive amount of polluted water pool up in an area that you just dug out. If you're a new player, this is one of the main benefits of digging out as much of your base as possible early on, because you can redirect pools of water that are all over your map into one large basin, which you can then use for your metal refinery when you start to transition into your mid-game phase. This large pool of water, even if it was slightly smaller or half this size, can run this metal refinery for many cycles before the water gets too hot to use. From the very first metal refinery build, you'll want to transition into something much more sustainable that produces power. This build here does exactly that. The metal refinery is going to produce extremely hot coolant, which is going to heat up water in this chamber and eventually turn it into steam. The steam will power the steam turbines and produce electricity, which will help recover some of the power that is used by your metal refinery. This is actually a very simple setup, but it may look complicated to a new player, so let's go over it step by step. First, we'll start with plumbing. The most complicated part for a new player will be integrating the liquid shutoff into their design because it uses some automation. In this case, we have the output pipe from the metal refinery going up into radiant piping into a closed-off chamber that will be filled with water eventually. As you can see, our duplicants are taking care of that right now. Once the hot liquid is in here, it will cycle around the radiant pipes and it will exchange heat with the surrounding water or steam, which will be then deleted by the steam turbines. The complexity comes from using the liquid pipe thermal sensor and the liquid shutoff. The liquid pipe thermal sensor will send a green signal to the liquid shutoff if the temperature is above 200 degrees Celsius. This is an arbitrary number that I've picked. You can calibrate this to your liking if you are going for a super efficient build. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be using 200 degrees because it will help keep the steam at a much higher temperature than what is needed to run the steam turbines. This means that when the pipe inside of this liquid is 200 degrees or higher, any input that is coming into this input on the liquid shutoff will pass through and will continue to cycle until it cools down below 200 degrees. Once the liquid pipe thermosensor detects that the liquid is below 200 degrees, it will close the shutoff and all the coolant will be diverted back into the metal refinery. So essentially what we're doing here is keeping very hot temperature coolant inside of this loop until it is sufficiently cooled where we no longer want to use it and it can go back into our metal refinery. Some of the considerations that we have to make are referenced in the chart that was shown earlier in the video. For example, you could not use water or polluted water for this setup as their evaporation points are too low to get the steam up to 125 degrees in order to run the steam turbines. So for a setup like this, you must use petroleum or crude oil. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to be using crude oil that is already preheated to 250 degrees. The water that we introduce into this chamber is going to be through our bottle emptier, and we want to enable auto bottling, which will allow our duplicants to get water from the pitcher pump in order to empty into this chamber. Alternatively, you could use this exact same setup and simply route a water line from a liquid pump into one of these output liquid vents from the steam turbines, and you could fill up the water until you're satisfied, and it will be a lot quicker and use less duplicate time. Now that our chamber is full and closed off, we can start priming the metal refinery. Like I said, we're going to use crude oil in this chamber to simulate getting oil all the way from the oil biome. The way to prime it is to have a liquid pump in your oil biome and using a liquid bridge to direct the coolant flow. It is worth noting that a metal refinery takes 400 kilograms of liquid in order to function. The speed at which it operates is bottlenecked by the liquid pipes and the output, as the liquid pipes can only hold 10 kilograms of water, and because it takes 400 kilograms of water to operate, the operating cycle of a metal refinery will always be 40 seconds. Once we have filled up our metal refinery, we're going to queue up some tasks. We've been running our metal refinery for enough that our water has evaporated and turned into steam. As you can see, the steam is still not quite hot enough in order to run the steam turbines. One of the modifications we can make is to simply add more water. To add more water, you can use this existing liquid vent coming from your steam turbine in order to add more water, which will create more steam. In the case of this tutorial, I'm just going to brush more water in. We can see the cooling effect in action. The crude oil is leaving the metal refinery at 152 degrees Celsius, and as the oil passes through the radiant liquid pipes inside this chamber, it is cooled all the way down to 111 degrees, and then it heads back into the metal refinery. This will allow the oil to continuously stay at a temperature that will allow the metal refinery to work without breaking. If you were to use something such as polluted water or just regular water, it would evaporate inside of this pipe and therefore break this entire setup. When you are trying to use a steam turbine to delete the heat, it is essential that you consider which liquid you are planning to use. Once you have your system up and running, both steam turbines should be producing around 500 watts of power. In my case, I have 518 and 528 and still fluctuating. In this case, I'm offsetting the power usage of the metal refinery, which is 1200 watts, by about 1000 watts total from 2 steam turbines. This is what makes a setup like this so powerful. And we can even expand on this. Let's take a look at the colony that I've been working on for over 700 cycles at how we can make this even more efficient. The setup that you see here is practically the exact same in concept that I just showed you, except there's a lot more duplication of what's going on. Here I'm using 3 metal refineries and 4 steam turbines. I'm also using an aqua tuner for cooling the steam turbines, and I have my steam turbines encased in a chamber of hydrogen gas, which helps disperse the heat and keep these machines running cool. This is not so much needed for the metal refinery side, although I decided to add it anyways. And if we take a look at our plumbing, the concept is exactly the same, except it is a lot more tight, with space being a much bigger consideration in this setup. The metal refinery still outputs the coolant into the chamber, which has a much smaller loop, and likewise I have my liquid pipe thermal sensor set at 200 degrees. This will keep the coolant in this chamber until it passes below 200 degrees, at which point it can then return to the metal refinery. When these machines are running at full capacity, they will heat up the steam enough that all 4 steam turbines will be running at close to maximum efficiency. The aqua tuner is simply being used as a cooling mechanism, and it is also placed inside the chamber where the steam is being produced. The cooling loop passes by each steam turbine to keep it running at optimal temperature so they never get too hot. It also does the same for the metal refinery. And the steam chamber maintains just enough steam that the turbines never fully stop running. This is what is often referred to as an industrial brick, and oxygen not included. When you are building your first industrial brick, you want to provision your chamber to be large enough to accommodate future expansions. So there's never a bad idea to make it longer than you think you'll need. You can always close it off so you don't have to fill the entire chamber with water right away, and then vacuum out the rest of the room so you are prepared for an expansion. It is also wise to build the necessary radiant piping inside of this chamber so you don't have to open it up multiple times like I had to in this scenario, where I'm using an airlock door mod in order to get back in here. I hope this video has been helpful, teaching you how to set up your metal refinery and how to run it efficiently and oxygen not included. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, this is aimed directly at new players to get them started at building their first metal refinery. The metal refinery can be a tricky building when you are first starting to use it, especially for a new player who may not have the knowledge of how to effectively deal with the heat that is produced. Steel is also a major component in this game, and you'll want to produce many tons of it in order to advance further along in your playthrough. So it is essential for new players to be able to start out at producing steel efficiently, where they can then use that knowledge to expand upon their builds and build more self-sustaining buildings in the future. I hope that if you're an experienced player and you made it this far, you take the time to write feedback in the comments about how any of these setups could have been improved. And if you're a beginner or a new player, please feel free to ask questions in the comments below, and I can answer any questions that you may have. Until next time, I'm Ethan, and I'll talk to you guys later.